This is a family story, a story about my mother's family. It's a way of solving a puzzle, a way of filling in a missing bit of history. The story begins here in Holyhead, on the western coast of Anglesey. My grandmother, Louisa Harper, grew up with 2 sisters and 5 brothers in a tiny house on the edge of Holyhead Mountain in a farm called the Drill. Her oldest brother was Ivan. He was born in 1898. He worked on the farm and then as a checker with the London and North Western Railway. I grew up knowing all of my grandmother's family, and I didn't realise until much later in life that one of them was missing. Recently, just before I got to the age of 60, family papers and photographs turned up, telling the story of my great-uncle, Ivan Kyffin Harper. Like so many young men of his generation, Ivan Kyffin Harper, my great-uncle, was called to war. So he went off to the Western Front in the second half of the First World War. He joined the Royal Garrison Artillery, and from there he was posted to the Italian campaign. So we're going from here, Holyhead in North Wales, to Genoa in northern Italy. I've travelled to the busy Italian port of Genoa with my friend, the photographer and filmmaker Richard Weston. Ivan's artillery unit was transferred from the Western Front to northern Italy. Ivan wrote home to his sister Polly in June 1917. He said, "I've been with another battery for a month, but I've got back again to 438. It's all right where I am. It's far better than being in France." The Italian campaign in the First World War is largely forgotten. The Italians and Austrians had been fighting each other since 1915. In 1917, the arrival of German forces created a new threat. British and French units were transferred here by train. Ivan served with the heavy artillery supporting the front line on the Venetian plain. So I'm standing in what's called the extension of the community graveyard in a town called Acqua Riviere. We've come here by train this morning. It's about half an hour from Genoa and the main line in to Turin. And it's a very quiet place. And it's a very quiet cemetery, although there is a road just over there. Looks like an industrial area. There's all kinds of industrial buildings. There's even a container here behind me. There's some fairly sort of ornate buildings here where I think the town cemetery begins. But in this small graveyard here, there are a number of First World War graves, and I think they are all British graves from the look of it. And in the First World War, Acqua Riviere was a depot. It was a holding base, and my great uncle, whose name was Kyffin Harper, is buried just here. His story is a very sad story because he served on the Western Front. He was serving with the Royal Garrison Artillery, and he was transferred from the Western Front to here, and he wrote home to his sister to say it was great to be transferred to a much quieter place. And being in the heavy artillery, he was some way back from the front line, and he survived the war. And unfortunately, a lot of troops were stuck here at the end of the war, and an argument broke out, we believe, between Italian and English soldiers. A gun went off, and Ivan was in a hut nearby, and a bullet went through the wall of the hut, and he was hit, and I think within 24 hours he was dead. And at home my family have a letter, original letter from the chaplain who buried him. I don't think he was Ivan's unit chaplain. I think he was probably just the chaplain who happened to be in this place. I think his name was Rev Aan Giri. And the letter home to Ivan's parents outlines the very sad circumstances of somebody that survived the war and 6 weeks after the armistice was killed by accident and never went home. There's a lot of graves here, and many of these graves are people that died around the same time. A lot of them in 1918, because this part of the front was where that was when the war happened. Some of the British Army transferred here towards the end of the war to suppress the Austrian invasion of northern Italy. And some of the people that died and are buried here will have died of wounds, but as far as we know, Evan was the only person injured in that incident, and he didn't make it home. And his parents received a letter, and we think from the history of the time that what happened was that would have been a wooden cross here originally, and then maybe around about 1921, something like that, when the war graves were made uniform as they are here. They're all standard British Army war graves. His parents would have been given the opportunity to pay some extra money, I believe, to have an inscription. And his inscription is in Welsh, and that's again probably unique to this location. He wasn't in a Welsh unit, as I say, he was serving with the Royal Garrison Artillery, but his inscription is in Welsh, and he was just 20 years old. It's a very significant place for me because this is my great uncle, dead some nearly 40 years before I was born, but I met all of his brothers and sisters. They were my grandmother's generation. My grandmother was his sister. I knew his other sisters and his brother. And this is the first time in just over 100 years that anybody from this family, as far as I understand it, any from my family has been here. So we've come here today we've laid a British Legion cross, we've said the exhortation, we've spent a moment or two before we started filming these today remembering him quietly. And the next thing we're going to do, because I was prompted to do this by somebody who's written a book about this campaign, and he said to me, when you go to the graveyard, he said, spend some time and walk around and look at every grave. And just looking at these ones nearby, the grave on the right hand side here, this is a Highlander. Here was somebody from the Army Service Corps, we don't know where he was from. We've got somebody from the Manchester Regiment. Just next to him is somebody from the Cheshire Regiment. So already just in this tiny corner of this forgotten graveyard, we've got all these areas of northern England already represented. In a place where people didn't fall here. This wasn't the front, this was the depot where people were probably sent back to. So a lot of people who died and were buried here were wounded at the front and came back here on trains, I imagine, and were treated here and probably died of their wounds. I kind of think of what it must be. I know he's 100 years dead, but it's just that almost sense of dying here and not remembered and forgotten. And when he died, his death was mentioned in a short paragraph in the Holyhead Mail, because that time so many people were dying. I think my feeling is that his death almost went for nothing, really, and I'm sure it didn't with his family. They must have been devastated. But it's good to be here to remember him properly. Army chaplain, the Rev Aan Giri, wrote to Ivan's parents on 30th December 1918. "My dear friends, the sad duty falls to me to convey the news of your son's death on Tuesday evening last. Some trouble arose between the Italian and British troops, and your son received a bullet wound in the chest. Although everything possible was done to save him in the local hospital, it was in vain. He had no part in the disturbance, but was in his own hut at the time and was the victim of a most unfortunate accident. His officers and comrades join with me in expressing deepest sympathy." Gunner Harper was very widely respected, and all those associated with him deeply mourn his untimely death, and the more so because he had survived the enemy fighting and was looking forward to a return to civilian life. I have buried him in the military cemetery today with full honours and many tokens of esteem and deepest respect. Words are too poor in order to express my feelings for you in this profoundly sad experience. I can only pray that you may be comforted according to your needs, and that the God of all grace will give you his strength and bless you with his peace. So, visiting this quiet Italian town, I begin to understand something of the history of this place. The men that served here, the men who died here, even after the ending of hostilities. I have stood among the 94 graves, soldiers from Britain and the Empire who served in this forgotten corner of the war. Their stories are here. They are remembered by different families in different ways. This is the last chapter of a story that has led me to this quiet corner of northern Italy. I have come here to honour one young man whose death was almost unnoticed. I may never come here again, but I am very glad that I have visited Ivan's grave, paying tribute to this young man whose death made no impact on the war, but left a gap in a North Wales family. This trip and this film have been important to me. 100 years after Ivan died, it tells his story properly, and perhaps it will ensure that he is remembered by generations yet to come.